Hello BookTube, Books with Banks back again today with another ranking video. Today I'm going to rank a series that I'm in the middle of. I've been in the middle of the series for a pretty long time, and I'm going to be ranking 9 books, the 9 I've read, because in 2023 I'll be reading books 10, a prequel, and book 11. And this is of course none other than Robert Jordan's massive epic. Robert Jordan and I should say Brandon Sanderson helped him finish it, or helped to finish it, the Wheel of Time series. So I started reading these books back in probably 2018 or so, 2017, 2018, around the time that I had just finished Malazan. I was a little burnt out on long series, so over the last 4 years or so, I've really just been taking my time with the series. Some of the earlier books, you might notice, rank a little lower, some of the more recent ones, even though some consider books like 6, 7, 8, 9 to start to get into that like slower paced, sluggish territory with this series. Those might be ranked a little higher, but that's just because they're a little bit more fresh in my memory, or the parts that stood out that I really enjoyed might be just happen to be a little bit more fresh in my memory. I do plan, once I do finish reading the series, I might go back through on audiobook just to try and pick up on and catch things that I missed the first time around. I will say before I get into the ranking here, I'm not going to spoil anything. I'm going to be pretty vague because, again, I'm not done with the series, so I definitely can't spoil where things are going. But I also want, if anyone out there was kind of iffy on how they felt about the TV show and isn't sure if the show's going to get better or if they should try the books, I kind of want to help give some sort of sense of what I like or didn't like about some of these books. And that might be able to help you ultimately decide if the series could be for you, if you want to get started on it. I will say before I do start with entry number 9, or 9th place here, I will just say that I do love all of these books, even the one ranked lowest. There are elements that I find very enjoyable. I think Robert Jordan's prose, while some might say it can be a little too descriptive, a little too wordy at times, I actually really enjoy that. I enjoy a little bit of redundancy, especially in such a big series with so many different places, new proper nouns thrown at you every single book, new characters. So I do like the rehashing, the going over characters' motives, certain character traits again and again, how many times one character might tug on her braid, how many times someone might play with the hem of their skirt, things like that. It can be a little redundant, however, I'd rather that there than me start to forget certain elements or certain quirks of these characters. All that said, 9th place, I'm going to put The Eye of the World, Book 1. I think this holds, and I understand he had to do this for Public 8 or to make it more likely to be published, but I do think this holds a little bit too closely to the structure of farm boy going out on a quest with his friends. Is there love in the air? Are there love interests? There's a little bit too much of that in this one. Too much of that just farm, obviously less the love stuff. There's some hints that there might be romance, but none of the romance in the series, at least where I'm at, none of it's gone really the way that I expected. I actually respect Robert Jordan for subverting my expectations there. But all the farm boy stuff, he's destined for greater things. He might just be the dragon reborn, all of this stuff. The prophecy, the old wise mentor, the suspicious magical school that it's easy to be suspicious of them, especially when they're all women. The weird kind of conflict between the genders that exists in this series, just starting out here, was a little rough, or a little awkward, I felt like, jumping into this, especially after reading something like Malazan. So as much as I like Eye of the World, as much as I enjoy like the introduction to locations like Camelin, or starting to learn about the Aes Sedai, even though there are better books that explore more of their politics and their society and their hierarchy. Just being introduced to all of that are all still pretty interesting and pretty compelling, I guess, hooks that we get in Book 1 of Wheel of Time, The Eye of the World. This is also one of the more fast-paced books in the series. That being said, kind of the locations, the village to town to city to village to town that we're jumping between every chapter or so, even though the pacing's pretty quick, some of those locations start to blur together a little bit. It's a little bit like, okay, are we going to have to remember all these places? I don't know. But, I mean, when you read a massive epic fantasy, you kind of sign up to be, in for a lot of different details that your mind's going to have to absorb. And I think this book, all in all, does a pretty good job at getting me into the series. It made me want to keep going, a little skeptical about whether or not I would like where the series headed, because I was just a little bit mixed on this first one. It's definitely not the reason I love what I've read so far. So yeah, in 9th place, Eye of the World, book 1. In 8th place, I'm going to put a pretty action-packed book. At least one part of the storyline's action-packed. And that's book 5, Fires of Heaven. Now this, in a lot of respects, is the sequel to book 4, like the direct follow-up to a lot of climactic events that happen in that book, with some of our characters. But then some of my favorite storylines and characters from book 4 just aren't in this one. They just don't show up. And I get an author has to do that with such a big series, has to spread the characters out a little bit so that when people do eventually reunite and do show up in certain books or get books where they're more the star, it pays off a little more. However, the absence of one character, I really felt it here. Some of the stuff that a group of the female characters, some of their stuff that I really like from book 4, where they kind of go in this book, it's a little meandering, I felt like. A certain city, a certain location gets set up in this book that characters wind up staying at for a pretty long time during this one and throughout the next couple books. And that's just not my favorite stuff in the series. It's kind of a city for some magical women. Again, I'm trying not to spoil too much. That being said, I do like this more than the first book because we have some great stuff that happens outside of the city of Carrion, that city that's kind of like the politics-heavy city, diplomacy-heavy, backstabbing, politicking kind of place. I like the stuff that's going on there. I like the stuff happening there, and with like the Aiel people. A decent book, interesting stuff, interesting scenes with some of the Forsaken, which is a set of antagonist characters. As the books go on, I find we get more and more interesting scenes with those characters, and I really enjoy them. They're one of my favorite aspects of the series. All that said, all those pros are not enough to save this or move this above 8th place for me. But yeah, I'm going to put Fires of Heaven, book 5, in 8th place right now. Then in 7th place, the most recent one I read, Winter's Heart. From what I understand, people start to really kind of burn out around book 8 and 9. This is book 9. I can see why. We have a lot of scenes of people just hanging out in a palace, wondering what subtle kind of passive-aggressive attitudes lie underneath these seemingly harmless comments between slightly different factions of slightly different magical groups of women. And then also there's some really interesting romance stuff, which on one hand makes me a little uncomfortable with how many women one of our main characters has, like, in love with him. It's a little strange. On the other hand, I actually think it's done with a certain amount of charm and respect. And I mean, I'm not one to turn my nose down at love in any shape or form. So it's a nice storyline. It's just a little weird. We also have just some of my favorite characters and their storylines. Let's just say someone gets taken away, a very dramatic thing happens at the end of the previous book, and in this book, I was hoping that their kind of allotted 150, 200 pages or so would show them doing a little bit more to address the situation from the previous book. And the fact that that it doesn't really go anywhere yet, it's just kind of a check-in with everyone's mental state for 200 pages. That's how a lot of the different sort of sections and character subplots are like in some of these middle books of the series, is what I'm finding. All that is a little bit slow. Everything the main character's dealing with what he's had to do in the previous book or two, his kind of I don't know, decaying mental state, or eroding mental state, I should say. His efforts to try and rectify that. Again, everything that's going on with those Forsaken antagonist characters, their scheming is pretty interesting here. I. As slow as some of the sections are, where it seems like we're just checking in with characters, I really do enjoy. There's a certain sort of coziness and warmth with really recognizing who these people are. And I think Jordan, like in those slower moments, if you're not super compelled by the action, because there's very, very little action in some of these books, maybe try and focus on what the characters are thinking and how their thinking has evolved. Like, they just have a passing thought about something. Is that something that character would have even considered in book one? And just kind of drawing that comparative sort of those lines of comparison, those points of comparison, I think is, and contrast, I think is a really fun exercise. And Robert Jordan gives us ample opportunities for stuff like that in these slower kind of middle chapters of these books. Winter's Heart comes in seventh place for me right now. Again, still like 6 more books in the series that I have to read, so when I read those could shuffle everything all around. Also, when I do read those and get to those, I plan on updating this ranking. Moving on, in 6th place, I'm going to put book 3, The Dragon Reborn. This was one of the first times that one of our main antagonists, one of our main protagonists was entirely absent for 90+% of the book. His absence was felt. However, I do think this was Jordan kind of showing off that he could develop a lot of the side characters, a lot of the secondary characters, and show that they could carry a lot of the weight of the plot and the action on their own adventures, what they're doing, everything going on at Tar Milan, with a certain character who was ill, and now he's awake and doing better and starting his own kind of interesting adventure. Everything there I thought was very interesting. There's also the beginning of a love story with one of our other characters and a young woman, and that's all very interesting. I also really like the climax of this one in Tyr, the Stone of Tyr. That's really, really cool stuff. It's one of the better climactic scenes, I think, in the first handful of books. So yeah, Dragon Reborn comes in solidly in 6th place. That's book 3 again. In 5th place, I'll put book 6, Lord of Chaos. Now, this is probably the one so far for me personally that felt the slowest. I think, amount of interesting things happening page to page, it might technically not be the slowest, but it did feel pretty long. A lot of the more magical characters sitting around in the city for a while, trying to heal certain things that have been done to some of them. And it just takes a while. A lot of people are dragging their feet. It eventually builds to a very exciting climax. I think probably my favorite climax of the series so far. But a lot of waiting around. That climax, though, and again, kind of as I mentioned with Winter's Heart, getting these moments where we see how upsetting sort of it is that some of our characters have much more dark trains of thought. The ways that they're having to consider the world and consider sort of like greater good equations, weighing the loss of some life with this saving of other life, stuff like that's really interesting. A sort of second magical school or group starts up here in this book, and I find that whole storyline really compelling from here on through the where I'm at right now, like between book 9 and 10. I really like everything there at the quote-unquote the farm. If you've read the series, I think you'll know the characters in the group I'm talking about. That's all really, really interesting. And everything, last but not least, the reason I think this is kind of really in the middle of how I like all of these books, I love madness and how Robert Jordan convincingly conveys a main character kind of losing his mind. And that's so much what this book is about. So many of these pages are kind of about that. It's really, really good. And some of the characters that I was sad not to see in book 5, they do come back in this book. Even if only for a little bit, they are here. So I really did like seeing them again. Book 6 comes in at 5th place. Then in 4th place, I'm going to put book 7, Crown of Swords. Now this one's a really interesting one. There's a whole new city kind of introduced here, and I think it's really, really fun. Fascinating culture to explore. There's some really uncomfortable stuff though. I would maybe rank this even higher than 4th place if it weren't for a kind of a royal woman forcing a younger, more vulnerable, weaker man to have sex with her and do sexual things with her. It's sort of played for laughs and played like, oh man, oh shucks, how's he gonna get out of this one? When I think it could have been handled a lot more respectfully and tactfully. That's probably the biggest knock against this book. But yeah, no, I really do like a lot of what we get in here. There's some interesting politics stuff. I mentioned with book 9, there's some weird stuff where you have a number of different women in love with the same man, and that's going to be... and that's just the way that a polygamous sort of relationship is going to happen in this series. In this one of those women gets to spend a lot of time with the man, and I really like their dynamic together. So like if it was just kind of a monogamous, like just two people together, I'd probably want it to be those two, and a lot of their really good scenes are in book 7, Crown of Swords. Again, more some good stuff with the Forsaken characters. But also some good stuff with certain persons' magical abilities requiring a level of anger and what happens there. That's really interesting. So yeah, Crown of Swords, I think an easy 4th place. And I think some people might say this is where the slog starts, or where the series starts to slow down. If anything, I'd say like book 6 is pretty slow. The end of book 6 is pretty exciting, fast-paced. This whole book felt a pretty exciting, fast-paced to me, at least. And then, like, books 8 and 9 start to slow down again. I think this is really a high, exciting point of just a lot of interesting stuff going on. Book 7, Crown of Swords, 4th place. Top 3. Here we go. 3rd place, book 8, The Path of Daggers. Now, I know some people really don't like how slow some of this book is. You have some, like, rebel magical people, or a faction of magical people that aren't, in the main group, and they're marching up through territories and meeting with ambassadors and kings and queens from these other city-states to try and get kind of a stamp of approval or of authenticity on their kind of magical faction to try and prevent a war. That's about as exciting as one of the characters' storylines gets here. You have some characters in kind of a snowy setting. You have some cool stuff with a magical item, kind of a MacGuffin that book 7 was all about. Book 8 here opens with them dealing with this MacGuffin, and that's pretty exciting. A pretty sort of exciting flight from a city, deal with the thing we found there, and then characters kind of disperse. Go off and do your own things. This is pretty short, actually, as far as the series goes. So if anything, I could have done with another, 100 pages or so to tie a few more things up. Maybe give me some of the stuff at the beginning of book 9, put it in here, and this would have... That being said, everything we do get here, I'm really into. A certain kind of foreign invading army force has shown up now and is being dealt with, and those scenes are, I find, really gripping. Also, some of the madness stuff that we saw in book 6, sure, it's there in book 7, but it's not quite in center stage. I think it's back in the main focus in book 8 here. So yeah, Path of Daggers, I really, really dug this. I was really eating this up, read it in probably a week or two, or a week and a half or so, and that's pretty fast for me for one of these Wheel of Time books. Loved book 8 of Wheel of Time, Path of Daggers. 3rd place. 2nd place, book 2, The Great Hunt. Now, this is, I think a big reason why I like this one so much is that it showed me Robert Jordan was setting out to do something really different and really unique for the genre. And a lot of this has to do with unique ways of looking at time, which sure are introduced in the first book, but we don't actually see the emotional kind of traumatic ramifications of those until we get like a scene in this where people are traveling across the long distance and see different versions of timelines, or a similar kind of looking through a window into different versions of timelines through a certain type of trial, a certain test that some of our characters have to go through. All really, really fascinating stuff. And the pace doesn't let up. A lot of the great characters from the first book just get better and better in this one, like Loyal. Rand gets much better, I think, much more unique. And we also get introduced to this certain kind of foreign army that is so sinister in just the way that they deal with magic and that they work with magic, and I'm so intrigued by them every time they show up. And I really like the books where they have a larger presence or they're the kind of antagonists. Really, really good stuff. Also one of my favorite, Forsaken, she comes in this one. Yeah, really, really good book, The Great Hunt. Also great action-packed climax. Fun stuff. Tons of fun stuff. The Great Hunt is an easy second place. But then, of course, in first place, and this isn't too different from, I think, a lot of Wheel of Time rankings, in first place I'm going to put book 4, The Shadow Rising. I think all of our characters get fairly equal time to shine, which I really love seeing. They've all grown enough. It's been a year or so since the beginning of the first book. They've all been through enough at this point where we're starting to be able to play that game of, ooh, this isn't how that person would have felt about a certain situation, a romantic situation, a political situation a book ago, a year ago. But now, by this point, I can really see how the things that have happened in the first 3 books have changed them into the person they are now. There's a lot of that here. Also, the exploration of the Aiel people, the Aiel culture is so much fun and so captivating. There's obviously a really famous sequence with the glass columns in an ancient city. If you've read the book, you know what I mean. For that chapter alone, I think this could be number 1, or I think this could be the best book. But then there's also a storyline of sort of a homecoming, but a violent homecoming, and dealing with leading people who never saw you as a leader, per se. And that's a storyline that we haven't seen any, or the other 8 books I've read so far in this series, I haven't seen anything really close to that type of storyline with those kinds of themes, this sort of shock growth that a character has to go through, because we've been watching him grow, but now he really is thrust into a leadership position, and it's with people that used to take care of him and might have never seen him as exactly a leader before. That's so good, and it's so well done in this book. Some really brilliant stuff with the Forsaken characters, again, in book 4. This is where they, I think, really start to step up as a larger cast, like larger than 1 or 2 villains, and they really, really start to come into their own here. But yeah, The Shadow Rising, easy first place. So far, again, I still have 6 books to read, and that's 6 including the prequel New Spring. This year, 2023, I'm only planning right now to read book 10, Crossroads of Twilight, the prequel New Spring, and then book 11, Knife of Dreams. However, if I get really wrapped up in it, I might just try and finish out the whole thing, but we'll see. So that's my pretty vague, general, spoiler-free ranking of Wheel of Time. If you haven't already, it would mean a lot if you could like and subscribe and suggest and share my videos with your friends. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye.